everyone. My name is Jessica Tang, and I'm president of the Boston Teachers Union, and I'm just really thrilled to be here tonight with you all, and really excited to hear about your presentations. And I did actually ask Paul to record because unfortunately I can't stay the whole time, and I really want to see all the presentations. So I had texted Paul and said, hey, can you record this, please? But I do want to just reiterate what both Matt and Paul said, is that, you know, I've heard from many different places, many different people, that this has been the hardest year that even veteran teachers have said they've ever taught in. And for you all then to be able to still execute this and do your projects and your research and these presentations is really pretty incredible. And also just incredibly important. As you all know, there's a lot going on in our district, and these topics are all very timely and necessary. And educators need to be at the forefront of policy making and sharing our solutions and ideas because we are on the ground and we have that expertise and that perspective. And so your work is very much a part of that important work, and we will certainly be calling on you in the future. I'm constantly saying, okay, Paul, we need you know, someone to share their expertise on X, Y, or Z. Can you reach out to the policy fellows and see who might be able to testify at you know, the State House, or meet with the legislator, or et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, just really appreciate you all, and just wanted to also thank Matt and Quaisha and Gina, and then of course Paul Roberto. It is definitely a labor of love to facilitate and do this. Like Paul said, we facilitated the very first program. I can't believe it was 9 years ago, Paul. And the part of the story Paul didn't tell you was when Bernadine came to us, we're like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go ask Richard. So me and Paul went to Richard. Actually, I think it might have just been me at first, and then or was it us together? Anyway, Richard was like, sounds good. You're in charge. So that's how Paul and I became the first facilitators. Anyway, all right. So thank you all again. And thank you also to Jerry. Really appreciate that as school committee chair, you value the voices of educators so much and are here to hear directly from so many of our members. And then Alan, who, if you all don't know, also does incredible reporting through Schoolyard News. And if I've missed any guest, I do apologize, but just appreciate, okay, buddy, almost done. Just appreciate you all. So thank you so much, and really look forward to viewing the rest of your projects.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. And back to you, Gina, I guess, to get us started.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Sheehan. I'm a math teacher at Fenway High School. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what you can expect from our Zoom presentation tonight. So we will move into our 3-minute section, where each of the fellows will give their 3-minute elevator pitch to explain what they have studied this year. After their elevator pitches, you can decide which Zoom room you would like to go into. You are not limited to staying in one room, but if you found somebody's 3-minute topic particularly compelling, then you might want to join that room and enter into a deeper conversation with that person. And you can bounce around from room to room for about 30 to 45 minutes before we close it out for the evening. And I am going to mute myself and pass it over to Michelle.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Naper. I'm a 2nd grade inclusion teacher at the Holmes Innovation School. And in an attempt to find a policy mechanism that could mandate authentic input from educators on education policies, I was actually asked the question, do other states besides Massachusetts have statutes that do not permit active educators to sit on boards of education, which in turn became my research question. Next slide, please. Oh, too far, one back. Thank you. So currently, Massachusetts legislature explicitly excludes active educators from sitting as members on the Board of Education, despite the fact that active educators are able to uniquely offer the most recent and ground level perspective of the implementation of the board's policies. Next slide. So the issue that I looked at is that currently the Massachusetts Board of Education consists of 12 voting members, one of whom is a high school student. Of the 11 remaining members, 7 do not appear to have any K-12 classroom or teaching experience, and 4 of those 11 members do have K-12 classroom or teaching experience, but it's from 15 to 40 years ago. So in summary, only one member of the state's decision-making body for education can offer current ground level data and perspective about what's actually occurring in our classrooms in the state of Massachusetts, and that's the student representative, who does get a vote. Next slide, please. So for context, across the country, there's 46 states that have boards of education, and 9 have active educators as members, and 4 have active educators as voting members. 8 states that have boards of education do not permit active educators to sit on the board, which includes Massachusetts. So the other 30 states have legislation that does not address the issue at all, which means it neither mandates it nor prohibits it, which ultimately allows active educators to reside as members. So therefore, the vast majority of states permit active educators to sit as members on boards of education. Next slide, please. So my policy recommendation is that a bill should be proposed to the Senate that amends the current legislature to mandate that one voting member of the State Board of Education should include an active educator. And there are states, as mentioned, with similar legislation that can be used as models for this law, which include Arizona, Wyoming, Tennessee, and Mississippi, just to name a few. And the theory of action behind this bill would be to strengthen the Board of Education's decision-making process by necessitating the valuable input and perspective of an active educator in order to ultimately implement more effective policies in classrooms across the state. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my policy research and recommendation.
So am I just jumping in? I don't know why there's this weird splotch covering some of the letters or something, but hi, I'm Samantha Laney, and this is actually my second slide, question mark? There we go. So my project was about receivership and other forms of state control, and specifically how they affect working and learning conditions for teachers and students. Next slide. So many of you probably have a basic understanding, but I never like to assume. So the first question is always, what is receivership? So receivership is a status given to schools that allows the state education commissioner to appoint a receiver to lead and improve schools. The first common misconception is often it's referred to as the state taking over, but the state doesn't actually take over. They just get to decide who to pay to take over. Next slide. Are you? Okay, great. So my official research question was, how does receivership and other forms of state control affect working conditions? Next slide. And before we get into what I did or what I am doing, the thing I always like to remind people is that working conditions are learning conditions. We often forget that what is good for teachers is good for students. The buildings that we are fighting to fix, the hours that we are fighting to not have to work are also the same hours and buildings and conditions that our students are learning under. Next slide. There it is. So there are 3 big effects of receivership. I'm going to focus on one of them today. So there's a huge decrease in community voice, because as the state comes in and they take over, they can take over the powers all the way up to and including the school committee and the superintendent. The second one is we see dramatic shifts in the teacher turnover numbers, and there is this huge increased emphasis on testing, and they're all kind of built into one another. But this for this presentation, I'm actually going to focus on number 2. Next slide, I think fancily circles it. Increased teacher turnover rates that we know obviously affect students. On the board is just a brief explanation as to why this is so important to me, because I started and continued until this year my teaching career in various forms of top-down control. And I can tell you from personal experience and research, it is deeply unsustainable. Next slide. So what I did for my research is I identified, first I started with what does that mean? Top-down control, state receivership, state takeover, because the state likes to tell you it's a lot of different things: receivership, turnaround, empowerment zones, transformation. All of them mean the same thing. It means somebody who's not from this community, who the state appoints, is going to be in charge. I decided to leave charter schools out of this specific piece of research because there's a little bit more complexity to that designation. Then I decided to connect with teachers and interview them about their experiences working under state control, because a lot of the working conditions are so bad are because the people making the decisions have no idea how they're affecting the people on the ground. Then just kind of analyze and explore for trends in those accounts and give insight into what causes this teacher turnover. Next slide. You will not be surprised by any of them. So the things that are making teachers leave generally are longer hours, less pay, less flexibility, an extreme emphasis on test scores, weaponized evaluation systems, and there's no accountability at the top. Everything is your responsibility. Next slide. So on the board, I'll just leave this one up for a second. You can read some of the quotes from the testimonies that I got. Highlighting the emphasis on testing, the weaponized evaluation systems, and a lot of the ways that students are directly affected in this kind of what generally becomes like a no excuses, longer day school model. Next slide. Sorry, I know people can't read that fast, but I only got 3 minutes. I don't want to take up everybody's time. So my recommendations to alleviate a lot of these problems are: one, to flat out get rid of receivership laws, get them off the books. They are unhelpful at this point in time. However, I am under no delusion that all the schools in the state are not performing the way we would like them to perform. So we need to replace these receivership laws with actual forms of assistance and intervention from the state that provide resources that are based on the voices from the communities that are going to be affected. And the last thing is that the way that they categorize schools as underperforming or eligible for receivership is almost entirely based on test scores. So we need to create a completely new metric of what categorizes a school as low performing. Again, kind of segueing from Michelle's presentation with the voices of the stakeholders involved in those metrics. Next slide. I think it's just my bibliography at that point. So this is all a bunch of research that I read. If anybody has any questions, go check out these sources, or I'm here. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Goldsberry. I am a school counselor for grades 10 and 11 at BCLA McCormick 7 through 12 school. My slides got mixed up. Can you go to the next slide? I switched them, but it might have been too late. So as a school counselor in BPS, I'm often the first point of contact with students and families, and I strongly believe that our first impression is critical, particularly in an environment where our school district is losing students every year. If you could go back to the first one. There you go. And so the way that enrollment works in the Boston Public Schools is families typically report to one of 4 welcome centers throughout the city. Families are given a comprehensive packet, which they use as a first step in the process. And that includes things such as the student's birth certificate, health records, and some forms of proof of residency for the family. At that point, if a student has indicated, if the parent has indicated that their child has an IEP or is an English language learner, they're then routed to a particular department within BPS. And that's because not all BPS schools are able to support all learners. Once a student is assigned, I had one more point there, sorry. Once a student is assigned, they appear in the Aspen SIS system in a queue, and that's where a registrar or a school counselor such as myself reaches out to the family to begin the enrollment at the school level. Next slide. Perfect. So there are some limitations, though, to the current processes that are in place. First of all, not all families are able to either accurately report or provide the documentation at the time they enter the welcome centers. And so I have seen instances in this school year, for example, where students are assigned in general education classes, and then they have to be rerouted either to a different class or even a different school weeks or months later. Another issue, which I'll talk about more in a minute, which is particularly acute at the high school level, is that BPS currently uses an age-based system rather than a credit-based system, even though our high schools use credits as the measurement towards graduation. Very rarely does any documentation, including transcripts or special education paperwork, make it from the Welcome Center to the schools themselves. And there's currently, that I'm aware of, no connection between these two critical parts of the process, that being the first point of contact, the welcome centers, and the schools themselves. Next slide. So as I mentioned, BPS currently uses a credit-based system. So in the younger grades, typically, even though they might not call it social promotion, we know that most elementary and middle schools do move students along based on their age, so that we don't have too many overage students in the lower grades. However, when they get to high school, the rationale for that goes away. Unfortunately, they're still using, this is directly from a superintendent circular from August of 2021. And as a result, something I experienced frequently this year is 17 and 18-year-olds coming in as a 12th grader, but only having 1 or 2 credits. And the result of that, unfortunately, is that our first interaction at the school level is to tell a student that they're 3 grades below what they were told at the welcome centers. Next slide. So I have some really simple and I think pretty easily implemented solutions. And I was able to meet with several members of the leadership within the welcome services and enrollment divisions, and they were very helpful. The first thing is sharing files and information between schools and welcome centers. This is quite easy because we all share Aspen. We have the same database, but presently I'm not aware of any system for the welcome centers to upload and share documents that they receive. Next is a trained school counselor at each BPS welcome center. There are only 4 welcome centers. And so while this may seem like an additional expense, there is a plan for next year to add 1 school counselor at every high school. And so I think an additional 4 would be invaluable to ensure that these processes run smoothly and effectively. Another one is as simple as perhaps a spreadsheet, a directory of all of the welcome center staff who are enrolling students, and then the corresponding counselors and registrars at each school. That way, if there is an issue or a concern, we can just reach out to our colleagues on the other side of the computer screen. And last but not least, currently BPS has a new teacher institute for all new teachers in the district, but they don't have such a practice for new counselors. And I think having there be a training regarding the enrollment practices and the use of Aspen could be a great way to make sure that these new staff that we've hired are ready to be effective on day 1 in their new position. And that's it. Thanks for listening.
Hi, my name is April Brunel. I am currently the 6th grade school counselor at Tech Boston Academy. Next slide. And my topic is looking at the landscape of the vocational admissions process in Massachusetts and looking at it through an equity lens. Next slide. So before I get into a little bit of just some quick statistics, my journey with this started in 2014 when I was first a middle school counselor in the Fall River district. And I saw firsthand how inequitable the process was for our students. And unless you had more or less straight A's and B's, it was almost virtually impossible to get a seat at one of the vocational schools in the district. That then led me a couple years later to have an opportunity to write an op-ed kind of examining this process. And there were a lot of other people around Massachusetts who were very vocal about the inequities in this process. And so this opportunity through the fellowship this year has been really great for me because I've seen some positive changes and positive trends about something that just a couple years ago, I feel like only a small portion of people were talking about. So who are we looking at and who are we talking about? Students in Massachusetts who are applying for vocational high school seats. And so on the right, you'll just see a simple pie chart. The numbers cut off a little bit, but that's 62.5% of students who apply to vocational high schools in Massachusetts. Only 62.5% actually get in. And then the second stat, and I just used one example of one population that has experienced a lack of opportunity in the admissions process and access to seats for vocational high schools, students of color. So out of those students who have been accepted, 62.3% of students of color actually have not been accepted out of all the students who have applied. So there are other populations, and the data is in a new waitlist report that DESE has put out about students who either do not get into the vocational programs that apply or who are waitlisted. And so that also students that have also been traditionally excluded from some of the same opportunities are students who are also English language learners and families who are bilingual alongside students that have disabilities as well. Next slide, please. So why are we looking at this? Simply speaking, there's inequity regarding access to seats. And for some students, they already have an interest in certain vocations before they even walk through a high school door, and some even before a middle school door. And a lot of these students are not having a fair shot at getting a seat in their education. And how is this happening, and kind of what is happening, and how do we start to change this? So first in this project is just kind of identifying allies in this argument. There is an education justice collaborative that has been very vocal about this process and has really helped move along some of the changes that have actually been happening coincidentally kind of during the pandemic. That, and also a group out of Chelsea called La Colaborativa they have also been very vocal. And then a big change and a big movement that came along is when DESE voted to amend the vocational admissions process in February of 2020, which is kind of an interesting time, as that was like pretty much when the pandemic hit. But they definitely were getting a lot of pressure from different people. And it was just so very obvious about how many students were getting left out of these seats. And so now what? Next slide. So this is the exciting part. And as we are definitely still in a place where a lot of work needs to be done, in the past year and 2 years, since DESE has kind of asked, I guess is a nice word, the schools to look at their admissions process and change their admissions process. They pretty much had about a year or so to make these changes. And then they would be looked at again and kind of vetted to see how well they're making improvements, which obviously it'll take a little bit of time to get data, but we have to start somewhere. And so in this project, some of the highlights that I saw, just highlighting Blackstone Valley Technical High School. So they had access to a CTE equitable access grant, and they use that money seemingly very well. There's no data right now to really say if this had an impact, but they hired a recruitment specialist, a data specialist specifically for looking at equity in their admissions process. They hired interpreters for, they seem to focus on Spanish and Portuguese. There are people that speak many other languages, so I think that that would be ultimately a recommendation down the road, but again, it is a start. For many of their admissions programs and recruitment that they're doing, they're also starting to have enrollment in a 2-year drafting program starting in grade 11. So that's another opportunity for students who maybe weren't able to get in grade 9, but are able to get in grade 11, and that they also changed their admission criteria. I did have, so those are some highlights that Blackstone Valley BVT are doing. I did have an opportunity to speak with Cliff Chung from DESE and Elizabeth Bennett, as that they did a really nice presentation at the Mass School Counselors Association conference this year on this very topic, more or less, and they kind of focused a little bit more on what DESE was doing. But 2 other schools that they had highlighted were Worcester Technical High School and also Assabet Valley High School. And by highlighted, I mean doing some of the more progressive work in getting a more equitable admissions process. And basically, they felt that they were highlighted because they did adopt more of a lottery process. And something that DESE or their representatives had said that DESE is working on to also expand opportunities for students and families. So this was not exclusive to vocational schools, but definitely included vocational schools, is the School Finder website. So families will have the opportunity to look up all their school options, public, private, charter, vocational, everything based on their address. And it has a lot of information on getting access and in different languages. So I think my ultimate recommendation at this point from looking at all the data is that at this time, a lottery system would be the most equitable in conjunction with work and money towards addressing what DESE identifies in their waitlist data report as an awareness gap, in addition to the opportunity gap, which is kind of more what I spoke about earlier. So again, just to kind of clarify and reiterate, a policy recommendation in this process to find equity in the vocational admissions process is a lottery in conjunction with money and support towards closing the awareness gap for families. Next slide, please. And these are my references.
Sorry, I think that, okay, I see the slides now. Good evening, everybody. My name is Samantha Weintraub. I am a 4th grade SEI teacher at the Charles Sumner School in Rosendale. My project, my research is involving the BPS budget. I know this topic is a really, it encompasses a lot, but I really gained a lot of interest about this topic when I got involved in the school site committee about 2 years ago. I saw how much time and effort and collaboration that our school leaders have to put into this topic. And it's really not a lot of general information that people have. So you have to do a lot of research to find out, you know, where our money goes. Next slide, please. So I won't throw out too many numbers for you guys right now, but this is our projected amount for our BPS projected budget for next year is 1.5 billion. And for our general funds, it's around 1.3. So most of our money does go towards our individual schools. If you see the small blue part there, school supports, those go into money for custodians, our bus driver, transportation department, our special education department. So those are funded through a different central fund. And then the other big component is our central administration fund. So you can see that most of our money is going into our schools, but I really wanted to learn how do we get this magic number of what makes up our budget. Next slide, please. So most of our money, as you can imagine, goes to our teaching staff, our paraprofessionals, and our teachers. I've seen definitely specifically at my school in the last couple of years that we've had to cut a lot of areas that are not strand classrooms. So if you were an instructional coach or a reading specialist, we had to do a lot of cutting in those areas. So after you take out money basically, which is for all of our teacher salaries and paraprofessionals, there's really not much left over for our school. I did a little survey with a few of my parents in the classroom, and we used to have a lot of school partnerships that we no longer have due to having to cut those. And a lot of our families said that they really wish that we could gain back some of our partnerships with our coding and our STEM programs. So that was a big area that families and our community have seen that we've lost, specifically at my school at Rosendale. Next slide, please. So I know most of you know, I think it's one back. It says, yep, perfect. So many of you know that our budget is based off of weighted student funding. So that has to do with a calculated amount that's projected over the past 5 years of a school. So they take the determining of how big the class sizes have been in the last 5 years, and in alignment with our number of students and their needs based on if they are special education students, English language learners, and they come up with our school budget. A good thing to note is that our funds do not roll over each year. So it's not like funds can be saved for a rainy day kind of thing. We have to use all of our money. Next slide, please. So through my research and after talking to a few different principals, doing a lot of work with my own principal, there's a lot of compliance that has to be rolled out first that are kind of the must-haves part of your school budget. So principals first get like a projected forecast for the budget. They're able to review it, ask questions, give some feedback. They are then given the opportunity to review it with a functional team. They get a budget partner, an analyst from the Bowling Building, where they get help with balancing their budget. The budget also has to be approved through Enrollment, Office of English Language Learners, and the Special Education Department. Our budget is determined, it has to be aligned with a zero-sum rule. So that means if you take any areas away, if you cut anything, you have to replace it with that same amount so that it is essentially balanced. We have a lot of requirements for staffing in SEI classrooms and SLD classrooms, which also kind of rule out some of the additional staffing that we should have at our school because those are direct requirements. So we need to have paraprofessionals in SEI classrooms, as you know, in grades K1 and K2 and our sub-separate classrooms. Next slide, please. So the timeline, the projected timeline for the budget seems pretty short to me. During budget season, I constantly see principals, running around trying to get things completed and submitted as quickly as they can. So their budget forecast is released in early December, and they kind of create their proposed plan. In early January, the school leaders must submit their balanced budget, and they have to take it to the school site committee. The school site committee can comment on it, but they basically only sign off that they've seen and read it. They don't get to have a final say if they disagree with the way that a school leader has allocated the funds. Then in mid-January, the budget collabs begin, where all of the parties in central office review the budget. And then February through summer is when hiring happens. So the budget is signed off, staff can be changed and hired into vacant positions. And that's when they know for sure if they have a certain position at that school. So that goes on through February all the way until the summer. Next slide, please. So you will see in, oh, sorry, it should say enrollment. It should have a picture with enrollment on the top. It might be. Yep, thank you.
So I'm sorry, Samantha, we're at 7 minutes now. So if you can try to wrap.
Sorry. Okay, yes. So basically enrollment matters. We need to have our seats filled in order to get the most amount for our students. If our seats are not filled, we are not getting a significant budget, and our budget is lowered. So finally, for you can just skip down to my recommendations, which is the last slide. And it should be. So my recommendations are that we give principals some more training in budgeting and finance. A lot of our principals don't have a lot of background in finance. And also a proposal, we need to advocate to Michelle Wu and the city of Boston that our central funds for rebuilding our schools needs to come from the city of Boston, that it should not come out of the BPS funds. So I can talk a little bit more in depth about that in our breakout rooms, but that is about it. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Isabel Schooler, and I am a first grade teacher at the Henry Grew School in Hyde Park. Next slide, please. And my research question is, why is enrollment declining in Boston Public Schools? Next slide. So as a first grade teacher in a general education classroom, I can have up to 22 students in my classroom. When I started teaching in 2016, I had around 20 students in my class. And as the years have gone on, the number of students in my class has decreased. And this year, I started the year with 12 students on my roster. As you can see in those little seats, we have a lot of room left. This coincides with the district's declining enrollment. Boston Public Schools enrollment is down over 8,000 students, or 14% since the school year 2015, according to Boston Indicators. Next slide. While DESE does not have or cannot provide data about why students are leaving, after talking with many families, I believe the reason for this declining enrollment is the lack of access to affordable housing in Boston. According to the Brookings Institute, despite the economic expansion of the last decade, Greater Boston didn't build enough homes to keep up with demand. Meanwhile, the housing prices increased 53% during this period, which far outpaced the household income growth. The Inclusionary Development Project in Boston, or the IDP, requires housing developments with 10 units or more to have income restrictions for 13% of those units. This small percentage of units are made affordable for households that earn up to 70% of the area median income, or AMI. And as you can see on this map here, our AMI is calculated including cities like Brookline, Newton, and Cambridge. So these wealthy cities and towns skew our AMI to an income of $113,300 per year for a 4-person household. And according to the United States Census Bureau, the median income in Boston in 2019 for a household was $71,115. Therefore, these income restricted units are not accessible or affordable for many households that live in their neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So I am recommending 3 major policy changes to increase enrollment in Boston Public Schools by making it possible for our families to stay in Boston. First, we need to raise the IDP so that 30% or more of housing development units are income restricted rather than the 13% that currently are. Second, we need to make these rental units affordable to renters at 30% of the area median income, or we need to localize the calculation of the AMI to only include the real incomes of households in our Boston neighborhoods. Third, we need to introduce rent stabilization to protect our families from being pushed out of our cities due to rent increases. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Hello, everybody. I didn't know I was next. Can you hit the next slide? Thanks. Hi, so my name is Elizabeth. I am a kindergarten teacher in an ESL classroom in East Boston Early Education Center. I came here as a teacher from somewhere else, from outside of Massachusetts 2 years ago. And to teach here, I had to get something called an SEI endorsement, and I got it. And yet I was not really prepared for how things were different here in Massachusetts about how we do instruction and accountability and test scores for our English language learners. So my question is, what is this SEI endorsement, and is it meaningfully in fulfilling its intended purpose? Next slide, please. So a little background on this. Oh, this slide is not updated, Gina. I am so sorry. So this is a lot more background than you're supposed to have. So the SEI endorsement program for current teachers was rolled out between 2013 and 2016, basically because the U.S. Department of Justice found that English language learners were not actually being counted or supported in classrooms across the Commonwealth. So you can hit the next slide, please. If you were a teacher then, there was a class that you could take in order to get this SEI endorsement. But if you're like me and you've come along later, there's a lot of ways that you can get this SEI endorsement, but far and away the easiest one is taking one test, the MTEL 56. Next slide, please. So we know a few things going into this question, right? Single courses or sessions of professional development impact teaching practice a lot less in the long term than ongoing coaching and cycles of feedback, according to pedagogical research. We also know that having racially and linguistically diverse teachers is really beneficial for diverse students, like the students of Boston Public Schools, for example. We also know that historically standardized tests have discriminated against people of diverse backgrounds. So is this SEI endorsement policy improving outcomes for students to a meaningful degree in light of its potential effect on teacher diversity? Next slide, please. So to answer this question, I looked at two things. Number one, have student outcomes changed? I did some interviews to figure out how Massachusetts measures, and I looked at the publicly available data for the standardized tests that Massachusetts has been using to answer that question, specifically the MEPA and the WIDA, which are available on the DESE website. I also used the definitions that Massachusetts has made and changed multiple times to define adequate progress towards learning English. Second thing we looked at is this impacting teacher diversity? Well, of course, the MTEL 56 is the easiest way to get this SEI endorsement, and for a lot of people, it's a necessary step. So that those results from that test are, again, available publicly, and they were analyzed using ANOVA. Next slide, please. So we're going to work backwards. The second question is super easy to answer. If you take the MTEL 56, both your race and your first language are a statistically significant factor in whether or not you pass that test on the first time. And again, there are other ways to get this endorsement, especially now, but for the bulk of this time, this has been the easiest way to do it. There's thousands of teachers who have failed this test, and this has been a really big setback for them for becoming a teacher in Massachusetts. Next slide, please. What's less easy to answer is this SEI endorsement having a meaningful impact? Oh, can you go back one, please? There you go. On student impacts. Now, on student outcomes, excuse me. Now, if this policy were having a positive effect on student outcomes, we would expect, especially after 2016, when the policy was fully rolled out, that the line would go up, right? So these are two tests here, or two systems of evaluation that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has used to determine whether or not an English language learner is making adequate progress towards acquiring English. It's really not clearly going up. Now, these are based on standardized test scores. We know as teachers, those are not the best way of evaluating student learning, but it's how the students are evaluated by the state. It's how we as teachers are evaluated. And it is the data that is made available to the public. Next slide, please. Now, this research is also really limited. I'm sorry, I'm having my computer isn't loading the screen. There it is. Thank you. So it would be worth asking ourselves in further research, how do these test scores map out onto things like graduation rates, matriculation rates, and things like that? Now, It's also worth noting the state has changed both the test and the definition of progress. It's also worth noting that to this day, not all teachers in Massachusetts even have this endorsement because so many waivers are in use, especially here around Boston. And of course, all data after 2020. Does it even make sense? We don't even know. One thing that's really clear is that this policy is having an effect on teacher diversity, but it's not as obvious based on the information that the state makes available to us that it is having an effect on student outcomes. Next slide, please. So to sum up, how can we promote educational justice in the Commonwealth, right? So a couple of things we can do. We can maintain curiosity, right? We can diversify the measures of student success to include things other than test scores. And we need to use those measurements to step back and say, hey, is this policy working for our students? Because if not, we need to change it. And to move towards educational justice, because focus on supporting instruction. How are we helping teachers? Think about all this time and money that's being spent on test prep and on taking the test and on taking classes for the test. What could we use that for that would actually help the kids, right? We've got to finally make policy decisions based on what's good for kids rather than what's lucrative for Pearson and what's easy for keeping out data. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Lucy Torres. Welcome to my presentation. My research question is, how does access testing support EL students? The Access for ELs is an English language proficiency test that measures students' academic English language skills in the 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. It is given annually in early January to early February. However, the results are available in late May. This test takes approximately 4 hours to complete. I decided to research this question because for the past 2 years, I became the ELATF of my building. And I believe that understanding how to use the access data is critical to better serve EL students. For this study, I decided to create a survey and had some follow-up conversations with LATFs around the district. I also met with WIDA and OEL personnel. There is a slide previous to this one. On the right-hand side, you're going to see the data that this access testing produce. Is one slide before this one. Yes, that one, thank you. It's called the Individual Student Report. It gives us information about how students are performing in each language domain. It also gives us a summary of what the students can do according to their proficiency level. As you can see, this report is old because students finished testing in February and we're still waiting the results now. And also, because of the length of the test, sometimes students really don't get to show all the skills that they really are able to do in the classroom. It also removes the students and teachers from the classroom. Can you go to the next, please? So some of my findings. So how is this access data used? It is used mainly for placement purposes for the next school year. And more than 50% of participants experience difficulties due to the length of the test or lack of support. Next, please. We could go to the recommendations. Yes. So I think that is very critical for teachers and schools to have access to the individual student report in a timely manner. BPS should create full-time LATF positions. And also there should be a priority to emphasize the need for teacher collaboration to use this metadata. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Gafunda Banks. I'm an ABA specialist from the Curley K-8 school. And next slide, please. I'll be talking to you about inclusion best practices and thinking through a plan. Next slide. This is a statement from Boston Public Schools regarding our inclusion practices. As you can see, Boston has made a public commitment to educating disabled students in the least restrictive environments. This website states that 11,350 students with disabilities are in the district, and nearly half of these students are fully included in general ed classes. This is a good thing. But what the site doesn't tell us is how they are included, because it does not define what inclusion actually is. In fact, one could go from school to school and even in the same school from class to class and see completely different models of inclusion unrelated to the others. There is no standard of care or operation when it comes to inclusive practices. Next slide. The fact that inclusion is not defined is not the fault of BPS alone. The idea of inclusive classrooms comes from the federal government's IDEA Act of 1990, and it doesn't define inclusion either. It does tell us that there should be specific action steps to assist disabled students in reaching educational goals, and it does mandate the least restrictive environment. But what that environment should look like is not specifically defined by law. Next slide. The lack of an operational definition is not the only barrier to creating a comprehensive plan for inclusion settings. There are many others. This list highlights a few of those areas. If we were to create a to-do list of priorities, we might start with the items highlighted in blue. Next slide. One group back in the 90s, and this was a group that I was a part of, attempted to help this process along by defining what an educational inclusive environment should look like for a set of children with a specific disability. They not only defined the environment as a community of educators, psychologists, and parents, but also outlined the prerequisite skills and accommodations that would be necessary in order for these particular children to thrive in inclusion. Next slide. BPS might want to take a page out of TAP's book. BPS has at its fingertips a committee that is already unifying the community and professionals through the BTU Inclusion Done Right Committee. Why not align forces with them to create a program that BPS needs and the community wants to see? We also need programs and curriculum to the recommendations. Thank you. We need programs and curriculums in the sub-separate settings that mirror the programs in the inclusive ones. And this way, students can be prepared for the inclusive environment, which comes with its own significant challenges. And inclusive programs need to come equipped with modifications and accommodations for the disabled students that they will receive. And lastly, a focus on a universal design learning should be a real outcome for inclusive settings, as it truly serves both disabled and non-disabled students in the learning environments. Last slide. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Thomas. I'm an occupational therapist at the Orenberger. Next slide, please. My research question is, how are occupational therapists involved in multi-tiered system of support? And I'm motivated to research this because I come from another urban district that implemented this model with OTs on their team and found great student success. Next slide. So before I begin, first I need to talk about what is occupational therapy. Occupational therapists use meaningful activities known as occupations to help students participate at school. We have a unique training in activity analysis and environmental analysis that make us key contributors to teams like Universal Design for Learning or Inclusion. What does our role look like at a tiered level? We help identify and address educational barriers, create positive learning environments, support student wellness, as well as prepare students for college and career readiness. Next slide, please. As part of this program, I asked, how are we doing this in BPS? Well, first of all, it's important to note that we are using a caseload model, which means our time designated at each school is solely based on those that need targeted intensive services. I also interviewed OTs who told me that there is limited time to do this work in their day-to-day practice. I also reached out to stakeholders like principals and even reached out to board members on DESE to find out if they know about OT's involvement in multi-tiered work, and there was a lack of knowledge. Next slide, please. We need to talk about this because it's the law. Education policy has expanded to include OTs in serving all students, not just those with disabilities. Revisions to IDEA includes funding for early intervening services for students at risk. Also, the Every Student Succeed Act has funds for preventative services like RTI and MTSS. Both these laws include occupational therapists as contributors to preventative work. Next slide, please. We also need to talk about it because the research shows that when we implement MTSS and include our related service providers, these are some of the benefits listed on this slide. The most important that I want to highlight is that it increases our access to services in the least restrictive environment. Next slide, please. As part of this, thank you. As part of this project, I was able to find one occupational therapist doing the work, and I want to highlight her as a bright spot. She is using students on her caseload to reach all the tiers. This has positively impacted her school environment because there was increased universal supports to meet diverse learner needs, increased teacher collaboration, and it also ensured appropriate referrals to special education. Next slide. While there's lots to talk about, I do want to highlight that advocacy is important, continuing to talk about it on platforms such as this. I have lots of handouts for us to discuss in the breakout rooms. I'd also like to build the capacity of OTs to do this work by replicating the bright spot we saw in this presentation. And we can do that through professional development, both for OTs and interdisciplinary education. Thank you so much for your time.
Hello all, my name is Molly McKay Bryson. And my question is, how could schools respond to bias-based harm? We're going to speak in this project about bias-based harm as another way to talk about discrimination affecting people targeted by systems of oppression. As a staff member at our district counseling and intervention center, I've had students share not feeling comfortable speaking up in class, going to class, or even going to school anymore after having experiences with this. And I believe that we who work in BPS have a lot to learn about how to respond to discrimination in schools from the young people who experience it. So I conducted 3 focus groups with current BPS students and posed these questions. And I was especially interested in that last question of how do they think schools should respond when discrimination happens? Something that they agreed on is that this is a problem. Many of them said it's a daily problem in their school. And I'm going to share some of what they said about what they see and what they want. Students said they talk to them, but they keep doing it. They don't get the point of why they were talked to. They just tell them not to do it and brush it off. They got detention, but it's not like they stopped. And another, the adults started acting like security. Something I didn't ask, but that students brought up was barriers that some of them felt to asking adults for support when this happens. One said, adults don't believe you if you're seen as a troublemaker. And another, if they think you're a snitch, it gives them more power, it gets worse. So what did students say about what they would like to have happen? One shared that it needs to be something to get them to go deeper. They need to think about their action, how their family would feel about it, why it hurts. Another, they need to hear it from people they'll listen to. And another, it can't be surface, not just one time. They really need to get it, but don't judge us. Some relevant literature that I looked at supported these ideas that punishment doesn't lead to transformation, that transformation is deep, ongoing work. It takes accountability and support. And And in the literature, there's also frameworks for paths towards trying to do that deeper transformational work. Restorative and transformative justice provide frameworks for responding to harm, among other things. Ethnic studies provides a framework for ongoing learning that supports transformation. And so both of these sources of information affirm the idea that we need ways to reduce harm and we need intentional ways to respond to harm when it happens. As workers in school, we know that there are endless asks on our time and our energy and our attention. And so for this to be possible, it would take meaningful professional learning, release time for staff building these school structures, and a broader investment in BPS into ethnic studies and restorative justice. If you could go one. Yeah, perfect, thank you. One back. Towards reducing harm, it would take ongoing learning for adults and young people about the impacts of intersectional discrimination and the root causes and manifestations. And that learning should center the experiences, the perspectives of directly impacted people and young people in Boston. And for responding to harm, we need to learn to facilitate meaningful reflection about the impact of what happened and the broader context it's part of. And when it's safe, when it's possible, to facilitate processes that allow people who've caused harm to make things as right as possible. And both restorative justice and ethnic studies provide frameworks for thinking about how to do each of these things. All of this takes commitment over time, but it's essential if we really want to make schools actually safe and affirming and accessible for all students. So thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Priscilla Lau and I'm a high school science teacher at Boston Latin Academy. My research question is about teacher diversity before and after the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of the emergency license option offered in 2020. Next slide. So to start, I wanted to show the makeup of students and teachers by race across the state of Massachusetts. Students are on the left and teachers on the right. We can see that there's a huge discrepancy in students of color and teachers of color. Next slide. This is showing the same data and the same discrepancy, but this is specifically for the Boston Public Schools in 2019. This question is especially timely given the increase in teacher turnover across the state. So this graph that looks like it's slowly loading shows teacher turnover over the last several years. And we can see that turnover has increased since the pandemic. Oh, now I think we are too far. Back a little bit. Forward. Thank you, that's good. So in order for someone to become a teacher, they generally have to follow this pipeline. So teachers have to have a high school and bachelor's degree. They have to pass the MTEL. Usually they'll participate in a practicum and finally apply for licensure and then get hired to teach. Next slide. Just for a little bit of background, these are just showing the several types of teacher licenses that vary in requirements. But at minimum, teaching typically requires candidates to pass the MTEL exams, which we'll be talking about with the emergency licenses. Next slide. Next one. So this graph shows basically the proportion of candidates of color at each stage in the process. So we can see that candidates of color represent a very small proportion of all the candidates who take and pass the MTELs. And that's kind of shown in the second and third, the third column there. While white candidates represent 66% of college graduates, they make up 87% of MTEL takers and 89% of MTEL passers. Next slide. And then back one, please. When we look at the breakdown by license type, we can see that candidates of color make up a larger proportion of those with less advanced teaching licenses, like the provisional and temporary license shown on the right two columns. Next slide. So all in all, MTELs are a huge barrier to candidates of color entering the teaching profession. But in 2020, the Massachusetts Department of Education actually offered a teaching license called the emergency license that didn't require the MTEL. So now I'm going to talk about some data that shows how teacher diversity has changed since 2020 and since the option became available. So taking a look at the slide with the graph currently, so we can see that teachers of color only made 15% of newly hired teachers in 2019, but that increased to 17.4% and 18% in 2020. Next slide. And we can see that when looking at schools with varying percents of Black and Latinx students, that effect was most pronounced in schools that had 75 to 100% Black and Latinx students. Next slide. So this is showing the newly hired teachers broken down by license type. And so we can see the emergency licenses on the right. Candidates of color make a significant proportion of those who are hired under emergency license. Next slide. So I wanted to see whether these patterns, so the data was all previously for the state of Massachusetts. So I was looking at how this would affect the data for BPS. So we can see that our percents of hiring of teacher of colors increased between 2019 and 2020. Next slide. This is also true, next slide. This is also true for the actual candidates that were hired. So for comparison, in 2020, there were 41% of candidates hired from the early hiring pool were Black, compared to 33% the previous year. And then it was 21% versus 10% for Latinx candidates. Next slide. So all in all, we can see that this policy change of offering emergency licenses positively affected teacher diversity in Massachusetts. So basically, in short, my recommendation is that the state should continue pursuing or offering emergency licenses and then explore pathways for emergency licenses to become more permanent licenses. And then at the district level, I'm just thinking about how to offer coaching and support to those hired under emergency licenses. One last consideration is, unfortunately, those hired under emergency licenses have a slightly higher rate of turnover, which I think emphasizes the need for coaching and support at the district level. Thank you.
Very good job, everyone.
All right, so